Hello, everyone. We're back with another episode of Fighting Matters with my co-host today, Steve Kwan from BJJ Mental Models. How are you doing, Steve?
Doing good, buddy. How's it going, Stefan?
Getting by. And of course, we've got the illustrious Luke Thomas, one of the most respected, best known MMA commentators. And we wanted to talk about the UFC betting scandal today, Luke, if that's okay.
Sure.
Can you lay the stage for us?
Well, let me issue a couple of caveats at the front of this conversation that your audience should know, and then use that to then judge what I'm about to tell after that. First is that there is some that is known about this scandal, and it's important, and we'll lay that out here in just a moment. But if I could just be honest, there is a lot we simply have no information about, including that the gentleman at the center of this scandal, Isaac Dolgarian, we can clearly say that there is something very suspicious. I think there's a reasonable evidentiary basis to make that claim, for sure. But we don't know if he actually did anything illegal. We don't know if he did anything wrong. And when I say no, of course, I mean having the kind of evidence that would give you the reason to make a claim that we could clearly ascertain he did something illegal. We don't know that. And so there's a lot that is really unknown. That's caveat one. Caveat two is, I'm just going to lay this out. I do a podcast with a company called All the Smoke, and that is part of the DraftKings network. Now, I want to be very, very clear about this. I have had not a single meeting or any dictum laid out to me that I can't say what I want, not only about this issue, but about any other during my entire time there. But to the point that we're going to have, the sports betting is such a ubiquitous part of sports media at this point that the entanglements that people like me and various others will have can be in any way significant. Now, to answer the question, where are we at 30,000 feet? It goes something like this. Last Saturday, there was an event at the UFC Apex event. This is their quite literally in-house facility that they own in Las Vegas. There was a bout between two featherweights, Isaac Dolgarian and then a fighter by the name of Yadier Del Valle. And early in the week, Dolgarian, who, by the way, 29 years old, was something of a hyped prospect at one point. I don't know what's going to be left of his career after this wreckage, was about a minus 250 favorite, give or take, which is not a huge favorite, but a clear and significant one. And then in just the hours before the bout and the event was set to take place, there was a massive shift in the line towards his opponent. All the money came in on his opponent, particularly his opponent winning via first round. What we now know is there's a kind of a monitoring company called IC360. They used to be called US Integrity. They flag suspicious betting, not just for UFC, but for NFL, Major League Baseball, the NHL. I mean, you name it. Anybody that does anything. They're actually quite good at their job. They caught this. And then they went to the UFC and said, there is something very fishy about this line. So the UFC went to Dolgarian and said, are you injured? Do you owe anyone any money? Blah, blah, blah. And they were adamant, he was adamant that that was not true. And then he goes out there and loses in the first round. And not just loses in the first round, but loses in a way where, again, Dolgarian was not one of these guys you looked at and was like, oh, he doesn't have a lot of skill. He just made it to the UFC because of some kind of quota system that they needed a bunch of heavyweights or something. He's actually quite good. He fought in a way that I would say is not in keeping with best practices. He was lambasted on the broadcast by Daniel Cormier. And then in the post-fight show, Michael Chiesa was apoplectic about how poorly he had performed. So now, as you can well imagine, everyone is insanely suspicious. The UFC said after the result that they called the FBI. We know, of course, from an even broader perspective, that the FBI has been looking into something like this reportedly since 2021, and in 2022 there was a scandal involving another fighter by the name of James Krause. It should be noted, Dolgarian used to train with James Krause. Whether that leads to any kind of substantive relationship as it pertains to this scandal, I suppose we will see. But the way that the scandal went after this is that there has been a reporter out there by the name of Harry Mack who has reported some stuff, some of which he has had to claw back a little bit. But in my judgment, the gold standard in reporting, Ariel Helwani, I worked with a guy, if he's reporting it publicly, I'm telling you it's true. He said that he had heard from multiple fighters that they had been offered to throw fights. And I can tell you, I had a fighter reach out to me, tell me exactly the same. And so it ran with this whole process of, wait a second. There may have been not just something suspicious about this fight, but it might be happening more broadly. And in fact, it looks like, and again, number one caveat, we don't know a lot, but there appears to be at least some evidence that a certain class of fighter is being targeted by figures to throw fights. And what is that class? Good enough to make it to the UFC, not good enough to make a lot of money in the UFC. That particular class appears to be getting approached, and the extent of the problem, I guess we will see, but that is a basic overview of where we are today.
Yeah, sure. I have a question here to maybe follow up on this. You talked about a certain class of fighter who may be vulnerable to this. And I'm guessing that what you're saying is there's probably this group of people where they're not making enough money as a UFC fighter alone. And so the prospect of taking a bribe could be very attractive to them. Do you have any idea of, or is there any idea of the scope of how much money these fighters actually would be making without this? And do we have any idea of the amount of money they've been offering, or is that all something that we don't know yet?
Again, so much we don't know. And for one reason, the UFC convinced the Nevada Athletic Commission to no longer release pay stubs to the public. So we don't actually know what Dolgarian made. But suffice to say, if you're on one of these Apex cards, that doesn't mean you're nobody, but it probably indicates you're not at the premium end of the product. There was one fighter who came out afterwards and was like, not involved in this scandal, but was like, yeah, I've been approached a bunch of times. I mean, of course, I denied it. And then someone asked him, how much were you offered in one of those cases? He said $70K to be thrown. I mean, I would imagine, again, what Dolgarian made, I don't know, but, it probably would not in any way be exaggeration to say somewhere around the 20K mark, right? 20K to show, 20K to win. I am speculating about that, but that's kind of where we are in this whole process. And just do the math on that. If you are, making 20K, and you fight 2 times a year, which is pretty standard, that means the max you can earn, not including any kind of bonus pay, would be 80K. If you lose one of those, now you drop another 20K off of that. Then you have to pay out taxes, management fees, trainer, whatever. You're just not making a lot of money in a situation like that. And these are not, the pay figures I'm giving you are not in any way unrealistic. So I don't know that what's being offered to the fighters in these situations is some vast sum, but your general calculus is correct. It's enough of amount of money that they probably feel like, and again, to the extent that this is happening in some kind of grander scale, that if I can just sneak this through, I'm able to collect a certain amount of money that would ordinarily be out of reach on a single night, absent something like a 50K bonus that they could get for, incredible performance. But one of no one's really brought this up, but if you actually look at who gets the bonuses on UFC cards, it makes sense when I say this. It tends to go higher up on the card. Not always, certainly, but as a general rule, if you're on the main card, the probability that you win a performance bonus tends to be higher than if you're on the prelim card. So there's just a lot of ways in which this can, you can see why this group was targeted specifically by whoever these bad actors may end up being.
I have never understood the economics of being a UFC fighter in the general case. I mean, yes, people at the top of the card are going to make substantial money, although arguably far less than they deserve. But the people lower down on the card, I've always been, as someone who's trained with UFC fighters before in jiu-jitsu, I've never quite understood financially how they make it work, especially with the restrictions on sponsorships, right? In the UFC now, with the lack of control over that. I mean, like you said, the numbers you cited, there are interns in parts of America that are going to get paid more than that, and they're not fighting at the highest levels of a very public sport like this. So for me, when I first discovered this, it was really shocking how little a lot of the fighters on the card actually get paid. And you can make the argument, and I have seen it made, that these people at the lower levels of the card don't contribute significant value to the event to the point where it justifies a higher amount. And maybe that's true that they don't justify millions, but they certainly, I think, would justify more than $20,000 to show.
I hate that argument, and I'll tell you why it's so obviously nonsensical. Number one, if they don't have value, why has the UFC scaled out in that direction to make that, frankly, the bulk of the product? The premium end is what we tend to pay the most attention to. But if you actually look, I mean, there's only 15 of the best welterweights in the world. There's only 15 of the best, middleweights in the world. If you're going to scale your product, you have to scale at 16 out. So what they do is, if these guys, if they air the prelims, for example, on television, they sell ads against that. Why would they not be entitled to a cut of that? More to the point, when they do these content deals, hey, we're going to give you, 13. I guess they're not going to have pay-per-views anymore, but 13 pay-per-views annually, 20 fight nights, and then another 10 on the road fight nights. They're scaling out all of that product as part of a deal to generate the revenue as contracted media rights fees. It comes as that bulk is part of that. Now, what percentage of it that they should be entitled to is up for debate, but literally these ad deals and these media rights deals would not be nearly as big as they are, because you can't deliver 40 plus events a year if you don't scale your product out from 16 in the world on down to 50 in the world. That's where the bulk of those fighters get put together to make 40 plus events possible. So the idea that, like, yes, is any single one of them responsible as a big revenue generator for the UFC? No. But as a class and as what their utility is for the UFC, it's extraordinarily high. I really don't like that argument. And more as just a point, if you're the one getting brain damage to do this activity, my personal view is you are entitled to the lion's share of what these proceeds should be. And we know matter-of-factly that that's not happening even at the highest level. The point you raise about the economics of the UFC situation is people glamorize, obviously, the very, very high-level guys, your Ilia Topurias and the like. Yes, those guys, the potential for what they can earn, even if it's limited because they don't have either laws or unions to protect their interests, it's still going to be, in an aggregate sense, millions, right? It's still going to be a lot of it. And so people glamorize that. But once again, like, what is the more, if you just look at, there's more than 600 or 700 fighters on the roster, the vast majority of their experiences are not going to be that. They're going to be closer to the other end. And, one thing that someone else brought up to me, I thought was a really great point. If you were trying to get a security clearance to work for the United States government in some kind of highly sensitive way, they're going to do a pretty thorough background check on you. And one thing they're going to look at is, to what extent do you have any debt or financial liability, or do you have a level of financial distress that can be leveraged against you? Now, in this particular case, it's not blackmail, right? Like, that's not what we're talking about. But the pain point of having financial distress, certainly as a causal factor, one among other things, can be leveraged to make these guys do things that they would ordinarily not want to do. I've seen people argue, hey, this is, it's an integrity issue. Well, yes, of course, on some basic level, that's obviously true. But it's also true that if you're suffering through, various things that can affect you in your life, financial distress or limits being one of them, that does just statistically make you more prone to be doing these kinds of activities. I don't think, in my judgment, that whoever is asking these fighters to do it targeted this group by accident. Seems quite intentional.
Makes sense.
I guess we have zero idea who targeted these people, but if you had to guess, from previous scandals in MMA or in boxing or in other combat sports, who is it who's typically putting pressure on these competitors to throw matches?
Yeah, I want to be very careful because I just don't want to say things that I don't have an evidentiary basis for. So I would say, one, because of the proliferation of sports gambling, new entrants into this illegal market is worth taking into consideration. What that might look like exactly. Could it be a slightly different profile from the history of what we know in terms of, like, fight fixing inside the fight game, and what those typical actors might look like? Because of the nature of how new this is, it's worth considering who that might be. Again, I don't know the answer to that, but just keeping an open mind. If we're looking historically at what this kind of thing is, typically this is tied to organized crime in certain cases, or not so much with, like, grand crime families. It could be low-level guys in low-level operations, but still, dangerous kind of people. In fact, one of the things that's been kind of interesting is, and again, I don't know if that's the case here in this particular scandal, I want to reiterate this as clearly as I can, but one thing that did come up in this conversation was Dana White saying, hey, if you're one of these fighters and you were approached, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell the UFC? And there's a couple of answers you could give, not least of which is, and again, I don't know that this is the case, but could these be violent people that you just don't really want to get sideways with? It's something to consider. At a bare minimum, there appear to be broken lines of communication between the athlete ranks of this class and the UFC. Something else, I think, for them to look at. But, whoever it is, they're lawbreakers. You know what I mean? And then potentially in egregious ways, these are people that, we need to find out who they are and what they've done.
You mentioned Dana White, and Dana White is a self-admitted gambling degenerate, and presumably he doesn't only gamble on cards or blackjack or roulette. So, is there any indication that he has bet on any MMA stuff, and how hard would it be for him to, in theory, manipulate fights and manipulate the odds while betting on that himself, especially if he ends up in a financial hole? Like, it just seems that that's so fraught with potential conflicts of interest.
It is an interesting one. There was an article in the Hollywood Reporter just yesterday about his gambling. I mean, it's really interesting. My brother has advanced degrees in mathematics, and we don't really talk about MMA ever. And he messaged me. He's like, "Did you read this article?" And because he had read it, which surprised me. And I was like, I think I had read like a few paragraphs, and then I got distracted and whatnot. He was like, what they call there's a name for it, like a stop seller or something like that, where once you're up, you just walk away, which is something of an unusual practice. And he was like, but if you just keep going to the casino, like the more you gamble, the more you lose. Like, he doesn't understand basic probability. Like, you can stop if you're up, but it doesn't matter. Like, the more you gamble, like, it just ends up one way. In any case, I would be very surprised if he was doing that. And I've been a frequent critic of Dana White, but if I could say one thing, it's that at least in the rise of MMA, they have been, to the best of my assessment, they've tried to really do this in an above board way. Now, they might be forceful about it, but if he was involved in that particular way, in some kind of theoretical sense, that would be absolutely ruinous it would be the end of everything. It'd be existential. He already has access, yes, to your point, like, if you're already betting on this, why wouldn't you bet on that? But to my knowledge, there's no indication this is part of it. To my knowledge, no one is even suggesting it. My understanding of this situation is merely that you got this class of fighters. Some of these, whoever the hell they are, shadowy figures, are kind of trying to entice them. It does not in any way, to my knowledge, involve UFC staff, Dana White. It's kind of concentrated in that direction. But the last thing I would say on this is, to the point you raised, if you gamble a lot, it's going to just raise suspicions. And then, I think the other part about this too is, and it's kind of looking at it, Kash Patel is, a fan of the UFC. He's tight with Dana White. He's tight with, obviously, he was nominated by the president to be director of the FBI. I am certain that there's going to be FBI field agents who are going to be looking, and apparently have been looking into this since 2021. And we know that the NBA scandal, by the way, started in the investigation started in the Biden administration. So these things take a lot of time. It's not that I don't think that those people will do their job very well, but it's like, how much will it get thoroughly looked at? Not, again, I'm not in any way suggesting Dana White, just whatever the operation is, how much will that get looked at when Kash Patel is kind of like, well, the buck stops there? I don't know how to answer that, but it doesn't fill me with great confidence. Yeah.
Yeah. That is the thing that I was specifically wondering about. The current administration in the U.S. is so closely tied to the UFC. I mean, to the point where, for all intents and purposes, they almost appear to be a marketing or propaganda tool used by the government. I mean, it is wild to see these walkouts where the president and his whole staff get special treatment at these events. And I mean, again, I think it incredibly unlikely that Dana White would be trying to rig a low-level fight. He has much easier ways to make money if he wants to, but it is illustrative of all of the different levels of conflict of interest when you have the regulatory body that closely related to the sport itself. I mean, just watching the news, I already wouldn't have much confidence in getting a fair and thorough investigation into this. I would expect a degree of bias already just due to what we've seen out of Patel and the FBI. But beyond that, in this case specifically, I really would be skeptical if they do a full and thorough investigation into what happened. What are your thoughts on this? Has there been any statement or initiative from the FBI that they've revealed, or have they been quiet about this so far?
They've been quiet, which probably is a good thing, right? I mean, if you're actively involved in an investigation, keeping your mouth shut to obtain the best information possible and to, take the investigation where it needs to go is it leaves us in the dark for long stretches of time. but that probably serves the investigation long term. So there's no real issue with that. Again, I think the field agents I would trust to do their job pretty thoroughly. It's just, not that the UFC would be involved, but just would they make them look bad based on what they found? I don't know how that would shake out. I think the questions about what you might get there, they're insanely well founded. I mean, you kind of indicated these walkouts with Trump, like they're almost like a propaganda tool. I don't think it's almost. I think it's explicit, and I think it's all kind of coordinated to a strong degree as well. There's UFC staff who have gone from UFC to the Trump White House. Stephen Chung, chief among them. Like the connections between them are robust, and in that kind of world, what kind of? Remember what they did with the NBA investigation, where they had this big press conference and. Like we found this and we're going to do this. And it's like, are we going to get something like that at the end of this road, or is it going to be a little bit quieter, even if they find some, relatively low level offenders? Again, these are answers that I can't possibly provide, but let's use that as a basis of comparison to see ultimately what we get in the end.
I see. Yeah, that does bring up, when we talk about whether the FBI should speak out, I agree with you completely that for an ongoing investigation, you would want them to remain silent until they have information that they can share. However, for this particular FBI director, that is unusual behavior, right? Normally, he is the first person to take to Twitter/X and basically use the position for some degree of marketing. So it is interesting to me in this case that Cash has been quiet. I would have assumed that given his affinity for this organization and his affection for it, that I'm sure he's on it. I am sure that he is heavily involved in whatever they're doing. And the question is whether that should provide any degree of comfort at this point, or whether it's just going to be optics. But I guess we'll see.
Yeah, also, he might not last either. I mean, there has not been a ton of turnover in this Trump administration relative to the first one. But I think it's not necessarily a secret that, like, for example, Attorney General Pam Bondi, among others in Trump world, they don't like Kash Patel. So, but it doesn't even matter, right? Like, if they sub him out, again, it's the connection between Dana White and Trump. Like, how much of this is actually going to be looked at in a way? I hope that my skepticism and cynicism is wrong. I'll leave it at that.
Could you talk a little bit about these betting integrity partners, like IC360, basically smelling a rat in the betting lines? How does that work? If is it algorithmic? Is it people sitting there going, no way, this can't be real?
Yeah, my understanding is it's a little of column A, column B. This is not an area of grand expertise of mine, but my understanding is that these people, again, you should look at their list of partners. It's like every major entity in all of sports. It's crazy. Even ones you've never even heard of, like some foreign leagues and stuff like that. The portfolio is quite extensive. They have both, I think, proprietary software that they use that flags this, as well as human agents on top of it that are monitoring every betting line for every event, for any kind of suspicious activity. And to their credit, not only does their list of clients kind of sort of show, wow, there's a lot of confidence that these people have in them because this is very serious business. I want to say it one more time. They look real good here. They caught this pre-fight and went immediately to the UFC and was like, this doesn't look right. And actually, what kind of is an interesting part of the conversation is not IC360. Did they miss? No, like they were on top of it. And apparently they have flagged, so according to some reports, they flagged, a bunch of fights, maybe not with the exact same amount of line movement, but my understanding is this is not the first fight that they have flagged and brought that to the attention to the UFC. The part that gets kind of interesting is, again, we don't know if Isaac Dolgarian did anything wrong or not as I speak to you now. But let's say it turns out that he did. The UFC, by their own admission, went to him and said, hey, is something up here? They apparently talked to, one of his managers/legal representatives. And they also said that there was nothing to it. And then, of course, you get these, really shady results. It's like they by their own admission, they were told by IC360 that something was up. And they let the fight go forward anyway. My understanding is, I think that policy is under review now. And I think if in the future, if IC360 comes to them and says, we don't like the way that this looks, they're going to be much more likely to take a fight off the broadcast. Because the weird part about this was, if you look at the tiers of what they do in terms of forget about Ultimate Fighter, forget about Contender Series, not the stuff where guys are not in the UFC, but once you're in the UFC, the premium end is like your UFC 320s, the pay-per-view. The second tier is a fight night, but they're on the road. So they're in Nashville, they're in Miami, right? Or overseas. And then the third one would be they're just back at the Apex where they own the facility. Those are the lowest tiered products that they do. Like, what is the argument that taking this off the broadcast meaningfully hurts it? It's nonsense. Like, there's no hurt to the product whatsoever. So the fact that they let it go, to me, I'm not saying that they don't care. That's really not my point, because I do think that they realize if this gets out of hand, it's a big problem. And again, I don't think they're in any way involved in any kind of illegal scheme. But what I would say is, if you've got auditors coming to you with alarm, probably is in everyone's best interest to take that alarm a lot more seriously, pull a fight that doesn't need to be there, and just move on with the day. Save yourself the culpability in being part of letting a fight like that go forward.
Well, I know that you've have a very tight schedule today, so I want to be sensitive to that. But I help me understand what the UFC or what MMA would look like if there was no sports betting. That's another way of asking, how central is sports betting to combat sports and sport in general?
I am so glad you asked that question, Stephen. I am so glad, because there's obviously now a question about, like, hey, what relationship to not just combat sports, but sports more broadly, should sports betting have, or betting have to sports? And it's an interesting conversation, and I think it's one that's going to be evolving. And for example, one thing that I have seen suggested as it relates to the NBA scandal is people misunderstand what's happening there. I won't repeat the whole thing, but people have said, oh, well, these millionaires were taking, they were taking bets to fix games in the NBA. No, they weren't. They were not changing the result of games. They were just affecting people's prop bets. Like, are they going to score 50 points in a night, or are they going to have 3 rebounds or whatever? They were not changing the result of games. I realize that this is, as I mentioned, the Dolgarian versus Del Valle fight is not like the most important fight, but that's the straight up result of an event, right? That's a little bit more substantive. And so I think that they have different priorities as a consequence. But one thing I've heard is, like, just get rid of prop betting. And I think I have seen people say that would potentially change the equation. We shall see. What I would say is this, though. I might differ from some people in terms of what answer you're about to get. I am going to argue that the relationship between combat sports and gambling is significantly more long-standing and robust than anything you see in any other sport. That doesn't mean that I'm not cognizant that the advent of betting practices might need to become under review. That's really not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, forget about boxing for just a second. Although, you know what? Not even. I looked up articles. This is some time ago, about a year or two ago. I looked up articles from, like, I won't say the turn of the 20th century, but let's say early 20th century, so the teens and early 20s, when some of the athletic commissions that came into existence in some of the leading states, there was articles written about why they were coming into play. And one of the reasons was they wanted to get a control of, promoters who were unscrupulous, and they wanted to get control of gambling that had gone on around it. These two worlds are intimately tied from the beginning of the Queensberry rules. Consider, when I first got into MMA, I watched it in the 90s, but like when I really got back into it in my early 20s, this is, 2002, 2003, around that time, I didn't know anything about gambling. I learned about gambling by watching MMA long before the advent of any of these betting companies and this proliferation. I didn't know what a minus 300 meant. I didn't know what these things were. I had to learn from it. Consider how many times, I don't gamble, by the way. People love it. It's not for, I don't personally get any joy out of it, but I have been in casinos only to watch boxing fights and MMA events. I've never been to a casino to watch hockey. I've never been to a casino to watch indoor football or any, like, the two worlds, they are intimately connected. Now, the common response to that might be, Well, then they need to be more closely interrogated and scrutinized. Yeah, probably so, right? I mean, clearly. So it's not an argument that, hey, just let them do whatever they want. That's really not my point. But I guess my point is this. We've extended sports betting in a number of directions, but like this whole thing about I'm going to watch the Capitals play the Maple Leafs tonight and I'm going to bet the under on Ovechkin not having a goal or 2 goals or whatever, that's new to the NHL. And when you ask, are the Buffalo Bills going to put up 30 on Sunday? That's new to the NFL. The amount of things you can do based on the proliferation of sports betting is certainly more in combat sports, but I am going to go to the mat and say the relationship between combat sports and gambling is significantly more intertwined than any other sports. I mean, boxing too, but beyond combat sports, significantly more intertwined. And it's worth thinking about that when we talk about remedies to situations like this.
I do have maybe one more quick question, Luke, before we wrap this, if you've got time. I just want to ask, I mean, since I have been following UFC back since UFC 1, there have always been accusations of fight fixing. And so I wonder, and I'd love your perspective on how much of this is different from similar accusations in the past where maybe it's just, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just background noise. I'm sure these accusations are always made. Or is there something very unique about this case where we have reason to believe that this is more serious than maybe potential possible betting scandals in the past?
It's a great question. Well, one thing I can say has happened is I've been talking to other folks in MMA media, and they'll show me stuff. This is even pre-advent on, more generalized sports betting that has proliferated. Obviously, again, it's not hard to bet on fights if you're in Las Vegas, right? And the fights are there. But, they'll show me fights from like 2018 or something like that, right? And they'll be like, I had a question at the time, but, this guy was making his UFC debut. We would just chalk it up to octagon jitters. Or, truly, and I mean this, one of the delightful things about MMA is just kind of how weird it is. It's weird all the time. And it's a quirky part about it, but it's in some ways an endearing part about it. Well, how much of that was actual quirkiness and how much of it was, it doesn't look right because now we have a different way of looking at it. And this is sort of one of the problems that I think we all have to really confront, which is, does it just jaundice everything and you just can't disentangle one thing from the other? I candidly, I don't know how to answer that, but I can certainly say that the question you're asking, a lot of people are asking, and now they're kind of looking around and saying, well, what's what? I think what I would say, though, is this to me feels potentially this current situation, which again, we really don't know the full scope of, but based on what Ariel reported and things I've heard as well, it seems like this one is just a little bit more easily facilitated and more consciously targeted around what I think the people who are trying it, not so much the athletes, but the people who are bankrolling it or whatever, I think they see it as like easy, slim pickings. Whereas if it was a famous fighter and a famous fight or something, there's just higher stakes and it is, there's a lot more ways that could unravel. This to me seems like a little more, how do I say it, operationalized and targeted. I am guessing about that, as I've indicated through this whole interview, but that's how it looks to me, which is why it's really important to get a lid on it and to stamp out the bad actors, because what it can do for people's perceptions about what they're watching can be ultimately quite ruinous.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Luke. How do people get more Luke Thomas?
If they're so inclined, you can catch my stuff on YouTube, youtube.com/Luke Thomas for my MMA stuff. I got a Substack, I've got a political channel, but any of those will do.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you, my friend.
Always.
Thank you, Luke.